Hey, what's going on, guys? This presentation is all about the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. This was a pretty significant historical event, as we'll see, and today we'll break down some causes, strategies, and implications of this attack. So without further ado, let's get going. To start with some of the causes of why the Japanese decided to attack Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941, the Japanese at this time were aggressively expanding their empire into areas such as China and into the Indian Pacific Ocean islands, as we'll see later in a little visual aid. The U.S., as a result of this, placed an embargo on Japan and also decided to freeze Japanese assets, the main one being oil. These jabs back and forth were the beginning of a struggle for power over one another, which eventually led to the Japanese deciding to attack U.S. in the form of Pearl Harbor. Japanese were angry because the U.S. placed restrictions on them, the U.S. freezing of assets, with oil again being the most important, and the trade embargo began to hurt Japan. Their army and navy would eventually cripple under the effects of the loss of access to oil. Japan, even after the U.S. clamped down, was determined to become an imperialist nation and expand their rule into other countries, and they were determined to do this even if it meant going to war. Then, to kind of put the cherry on top, the Japanese cemented their alliance with Germany and Italy, which irritated the U.S. despite their neutrality, because if they had to pick, they would have sided with the British and the French. Here's the visual aid that I mentioned earlier. This is Japan's imperialist vision. In 1941, it was a vision. 1942, it was a reality. But the darker red states, like Manchuria and Burma, down into Malaya and the Netherlands, East Indies Islands down here in the Indian Ocean, and then into the Pacific Ocean. This is what Japan had in mind for their imperialist state and what they wanted to have power over. And then obviously more so extending into the Pacific Ocean towards the United States. This Japanese thrust, as you can see, it says it on the right side of the visual. This was their idea of continuing to push out farther into the Pacific Ocean, heading towards the U.S., which kind of put the U.S. in a bit of an awkward state because they saw it as an act of aggression as they were moving closer, the Japanese, to U.S. territory. So they wanted to put a halt to this. Now we'll talk about the decision. The Japanese devised their war plan in November for World War II, and this obviously included expanding their empire into the Pacific. This would be seen as an act of aggression by the U.S., but Japan didn't believe the U.S. would want to fight a longer, difficult war, so they went on with their plan anyway. They kind of underestimated the U.S. and what they were willing to do in World War II. They also believed attempting to push farther into the Pacific Ocean would prompt a U.S. reaction, with Pearl Harbor being where Japanese forces could be challenged. So this is when the decision was made to launch the attack on Pearl Harbor as a surprise preventive attack so that they wouldn't encounter any extra roadblocks, so to speak, in their quest farther into the Pacific. Now we'll get into the attack by the Japanese on U.S. Pearl Harbor base in Hawaii. The attack was set for Sunday morning, December 7th, 1941 at 7:55 a.m. The attack's most important feature was a surprise attack to catch the U.S. off guard. And at 8 a.m. on a Sunday, you can imagine that probably wasn't too hard to do. They picked a good day. And there were 3 waves of the attack consisting of fighter planes, aircraft carriers that the planes took off of, as well as some submarines. So now more into detail with the Japanese attack. Only 2 waves ended up being sent by the Japanese, which we'll find out why in a few minutes. Those 2 waves had about 175 planes in each, which totaled 350 for the attack. The Japanese plane used was the Japanese Zero. It was a big, strong, and fast plane for its time. Japanese were advanced in the aircraft department. One issue for the Japanese prior to the Pearl Harbor attack was the shallow water, which was only about 45 feet on average in the harbor. This was a problem because when torpedoes were dropped from planes, they usually required about 75 feet of depth to drop, stop, and then proceed to their target. And 45 feet, they would have hit the ground and exploded right there. So the Japanese knew about this and modified their torpedoes to work in the shallow water at Pearl Harbor. And there were 6 aircraft carriers to launch all the planes using the attack, so they didn't have to travel all the way from Japan. Japan was about 4,000 miles away, so that's a long trip for planes to make. You'd run into possibly running out of fuel and other problems. So they loaded the planes onto aircraft carriers and ended up taking them about 300 miles away from the base at Pearl Harbor. This right here is a visual aid to show the attack plan, which was launched from, like I said, about 270 miles away. It shows the first and second wave, because the third one didn't end up being launched. We'll talk about that. and the routes they took over the island. And as you can see in the key, there are air bases on the islands, and the waves managed to hit these on their way to attacking the fleet in the harbor, which was important because they took out the air bases and destroyed a lot of aircraft. Different bombers were used for the attack, as you can also see in the key. Level bombers, dive bombers, and torpedo bombers, like we talked about. They dropped the torpedoes from the planes into the water. And then some fighter jets as well that were equipped with guns. This is a map of Pearl Harbor on the morning of December 7th. And as you can see, there are a lot of water vessels located inside the harbor. And the Oklahoma was flashing because that was one of the major ships that was hit, along with the West Virginia. The Arizona was a big one. We'll talk about a few of these a little later. Pearl Harbor housed many ships, and it was relatively quiet with little going on at 7:55 a.m. on a Sunday for the most part. So that's where the element of surprise came in and really worked in the Japanese favor. The U.S. thoughts, and because of a few miscues on behalf of the U.S., the surprise element from the attack really worked in the Japanese favor and caught the U.S. off guard. Some reasons would be we thought the Japanese were too far away for an attack. Like we mentioned, they loaded the planes onto the aircraft carrier, cutting a 4,000-mile trip into about a 300-mile trip. So that was important and smart by the Japanese. Our planes at the base were not fueled, and we didn't anticipate needing them again early on a Sunday morning. And the ammunition for the planes and the machine guns on the ground were also locked up. So if an attack occurred, which it did, it would have taken us a longer time to set up and get a counterattack going. The U.S. also thought that the water, as we discussed, was too shallow for torpedoes, so they didn't expect a torpedo attack. And we also simply thought that we were superior to the Japanese and didn't think twice about them surprising us with an attack. And all of these things mixed together caused us to be unprepared and unable to respond quickly, maximizing the damage of the Japanese attack. So now into the attack and damage. 2 waves totaling slightly over 350 planes were sent for the attack. Damage because of the surprise and unpreparedness of the U.S. was extensive. 19 ships total were either damaged or destroyed, including 8 battleships, along with almost 200 U.S. aircraft. Without fuel in the planes and the ammo locked up, we were unable to get a counterattack going and get a counterattack going quickly to limit the damage. Many Americans were killed and wounded as a result of the attack. And here is a picture showing some of the damage that was caused. This slide just lists some of the major ships that had the largest impact, speaking in numbers of people injured and killed. 400 men were trapped inside the USS Oklahoma alive as it sank, and they drowned after a torpedo hit it. The USS West Virginia also sank with members trapped on the ship, and as the ship sank, it slowly began to fill up with water, with some of these men taking up to a week to die. The USS California ship was completely destroyed. The USS Utah was bombed and rolled over, killing 58 people. And then these are just some pictures of those ships. This right here is the Oklahoma. This is the West Virginia. This is the California. And this picture is a little blurry, but you can see the bottom of the Utah as it rolled over and sank upside down. And the biggest impact that came out of Pearl Harbor and the biggest memory was the USS Arizona. As you can see it functioning over here on the right. Huge ship carrying a lot of people. You can see a ton of people on board. The Arizona was bombed at the front of the ship, which was holding roughly 1 million pounds of TNT. This obviously caused the ship to explode, and the ship sank in just a few minutes. Almost 1,200 men were killed on the Arizona alone because of the explosion and the rapid sinking that followed. And the Arizona really became the symbol of the Pearl Harbor attack because of this massive loss of life. And as you can see in this picture here, well, here's the bombing and then talking about the pounds of TNT and the men that were killed, 1177 to be exact. And then in this picture, you can see the ship blew up and smoke rapidly rising and sinking in just a matter of minutes. That large ship that we saw functioning at the beginning of the slide, now almost in half and almost completely underwater. So the U.S. did manage to fuel and load 14 planes and get them into the air and fight so a small counterattack. 9 to 15 planes were managed to be shot down by 3 pilots, George Welch, Kenneth Taylor, and Francis Gabrisky. This effort earned Gabrisky the honors of being an American ace, which is usually earned from shooting down 5 or more enemy aircraft in an aerial battle, so he was credited with at least 5 Japanese aircraft that he shot down. And we were also able to load up some guns with ammunition from the ground, which managed to shoot down roughly 15 planes as well, so about 30 Japanese planes were taken down. And then this is a picture. On the left, you can see George Welch and Kenneth Taylor, and then on the right, you can see Gabrisky and his plane, and the Nazi stickers on his plane are more aircraft that he was able to shoot down. This slide shows the American casualty numbers from the attack on Pearl Harbor, giving the number of killed and wounded Navy men, Army members, Marines, and civilians, wide range of people. I've also added a chart to help you better visualize these numbers and differentiate between the people that were killed and wounded. As you can see, a lot of Navy members were killed in the attack due to being on board the ships that sank. Some U.S. mistakes on December 7th. About an hour before the attack, a Japanese submarine was spotted and torpedoed near Pearl Harbor. This message was then sent to headquarters, but it never arrived, got lost. It would have at least had members at the base suspicious and more alert if something were to happen, and maybe we would have loaded the planes up or unlocked the ammunition. Also, around 40 minutes before the attack, as you can see here, there was a haze spotted on the radar at the harbor's headquarters, but it was misread by higher authorities as friendly B-17 bombers and dismissed as nothing. This haze was obviously the Japanese fleet coming. A letter from the government in Washington, D.C. to Admiral Kimmel of the U.S. Navy was also delayed and never arrived, and we intercepted a message from the Japanese, and the message that we sent to Kimmel was, quote, an attack was imminent by Japan. Pearl Harbor attack would have been handled much better if these mistakes weren't made by the U.S. because we could have launched a counterattack much quicker than we did. Some of the Japanese mistakes, as you can believe it, they made a few. They failed to launch their third wave of the attack. They thought that the element of surprise had been compromised, but as we talked about before, we only had 14 planes in the air, and they only lost about 30 of their 350 planes launched. So at this point, why would you not send the third wave and try to do even more damage? They also couldn't locate the U.S. aircraft carriers that were out training. There was a group of carriers that were out training that Sunday morning, and they couldn't locate them to put an attack on them. They also didn't finish a lot of the ships off, and many were able to be repaired rather quickly and back in action in months, which was part of the reason it was a head-scratcher why they didn't send the third wave. And they also underestimated our will to fight. As you can see, a propaganda poster on the right that has Uncle Sam saying we need to avenge Pearl Harbor. And this was a real rallying point for the U.S. going into World War II. The next day, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, our U.S. president at this time, he spoke on the attack and is quoted with the famous December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. He gave this speech in front of Congress the next day, and we were able to go to war. So this is just a few videos if you want to watch them. One of them is the quote, and then another one is part of his speech with a little propaganda going into it. The U.S. declared war the very next day after the attack. Germany and Italy declared war on the U.S. on December 11th, the very next day after we declared war, and this marked the U.S. officially being engaged in World War II. This is basically a recap video of everything that we just talked about. If you guys want to watch this and go back through, get a little recap of everything we just talked about. Some significance of the attack. Obviously, it led to the U.S. directly joining World War II, when before this we were neutral. The attack provides American people with a willingness to fight and almost like a reason to fight. It justified us going into the war because neutrality was our stance, but now we had a reason we were attacked, so we can join the war. And this is a picture of a group of volunteers after the Pearl Harbor, and the sign says, "Here we are, volunteers for Pearl Harbor," and these men were willing to fight after the Pearl Harbor attack, and the U.S. really rallied around this surprise attack from the Japanese. And here you can see the USS Arizona was made into a memorial to recognize what happened that day. The sunk ship, put a little memorial over it, and you can tour that. And these are my sources, and That's it.